lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
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 As a captain, as a commander, as a fan, I want to say this. Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower deck, lower decks, lower decks.
Save lower decks, save lower decks, save lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks. Save lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks. Yes.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks. Cheers.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks. Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks.
Lower decks, lower decks, lower decks, lower decks. And here comes the big finale. Lower decks.
Dr. Phil Flux, thank you guys, and good luck.
Be well, long life, happiness. Keep dancing, keep singing.
Let me raise this glass of carefully programmed champagne from my replicator here in my Star Trek kitchen.
All the best to all of you. At Lower Decks, I hope your mission can be accomplished.
Lower Decks is the universal translator of all Star Trek shows. So, in my summation, it's probably the most important Trek out there.
I love that you guys are doing this, trying to get an incredible show, more episodes. I think it's awesome.
Thank you very much. May you live long and prosper.